In his last letter to his wife, Patrice Lumumba wrote, "I know and feel in my very heart of hearts that sooner or later my people will rid themselves of all their enemies, foreign and domestic, that they will rise up as one to say no to the shame and degradation of colonialism and regain their dignity in the pure light of day." Lumumba wrote these lines probably only days before his assassination. And even though he was betrayed by his own friend and about to die, he knew his people. He knew that the Congolese were destined for greatness. He believed in the Congo. The tale of the Congo is not finished yet, but observing the Democratic Republic of the Congo since Lumumba's death, it is frustrating and saddening to see the exploitation, the devastation that has left the country constantly weak and vulnerable, to the point that it probably never saw a single day of peace since the first time the white man set foot on its soil. Just looking at the last 30 years, the First and Second Congo War and its aftermath cost the lives of around 6 million people. Another 7 million Congolese are displaced, more than at any other time in history. But this is no surprise. What if I tell you that this weakness of the Congo, the constant warfare, is deliberate? That even though since 3 decades the country is an active war zone, there has never been a significant international media outcry about it. There was also never really an honest attempt to stop this madness. Why? Because there are too many parties profiting from this chaos. And that's also what makes this conflict so hard to understand and for journalists so hard to sell to the public. It's the complexity of it. So today, let's take a look at the Congo conflict. When did it start? Who are the good and bad actors here, and how, or if, this crisis can ever come to an end? As always, to understand current conflicts, it's necessary to look back at history, because also this conflict has roots in colonial times. Just a little side note before doing that, on the pre-colonial times. Today's area of the DRC was populated as early as 90,000 years ago, as discoveries show, like the Semliki harpoon, in comparison to Europe, where the first modern humans showed up only 40,000 years later. So just put into perspective how long there was already life, culture and history happening in the Congo area. But coming back to modern times and the fateful year of 1885. In this year, the Berlin Conference was held and the King of Belgium, Leopold II, was hungry for a slice of this magnificent African cake. His words, not mine. He got a big chunk of that cake. The Congo Free State, as it was called, is after Algeria the second largest country in Africa, and the population in 1885 was estimated to be up to 20 million people, with a history that dated back to 90,000 years ago, as I said. So that was certainly not a no-man's land. The Europeans, of course, ignored that, and the Congo became the only colony that was in private ownership of one individual. This cruel had nothing better to do than to enslave these people living there and forcing them to harvest rubber and ivory under the eyes of sadistic Belgian administrators. In these 23 years of what we now call the Congo atrocities, up to 13 million people were killed. The population was brutally halved and traumatized for generations. Then the Belgian state took over and held the colony for another 52 years, till its independence in 1960. That was the time of Patrice Lumumba. A short time indeed, he was only in office for a few months, but he still gives hope to the oppressed people. Lumumba was the first democratically elected prime minister of the Congo and had big plans for the country. Plans which the colonial powers and the US didn't like because they excluded them. We all know how it ended. Lumumba was the greatest advocate for his own people and country, and the West noticed that it's not easy to negotiate with him over the Congo's vast resources. With the complicity of American, Belgian and British intelligence services, a coup was staged against him. His backstabbing friend, Joseph Désiré Mobutu, later known as Mobutu Sese Seko, took over and he would rule the Congo, which he named into Zaire, as a corrupted dictator for over 32 years, creating the conditions for this mess that we have today. And he did so with the backing of numerous international powers, especially the US. In the 90s, Mobutu was still clinging to power after 3 decades of rule. But he realized that times were changing. Democratic forces were giving him a hard time. To distract and fragment the different progressive movements, he began fomenting ethnic division. And as a result, bloody feuds over identity and land broke out, especially in the eastern Congo. Now it's getting really heated up. In 1994, a genocide takes place in the neighboring Rwanda, where in a period of only 100 days, armed Hutu militias killed around 600,000 Tutsi, moderate Hutu and Twa. The genocide ended when the RPF, under the leadership of Paul Kagame, overthrew the Hutu government in Kigali. But where did all the perpetrators of the violence go? These armed Hutu militias? You guessed it, they went to the area of the eastern Zaire. 1.5 million people went there. Of course, they were not all part of the genocide. Some were just afraid because they were Hutu and the RPF called for retaliation. But now there was this mess of new refugees in Zaire, and some of whom were indeed armed genocidaires. They stayed active, formed new groups, took control of mines and started attacking Rwanda. It's already so complicated, but it gets even worse. With an old and incapable leader like Mobutu, who ruled the country to shambles, and a growing of numerous militant forces in the east, Zaire was a dying state. And it did die, at least the name. In 1996, the Tutsi-dominated AFDL, led by Laurent Désiré Kabila, along with Rwandan troops, launched offensives in eastern DRC, sparking the First Congo War. Uganda, Eritrea, Angola and Burundi, all Rwandan allies, joined the war. The alliance was victorious. Mobutu fled to Morocco and Zaire was renamed to Democratic Republic of the Congo. So now we know there is something called the Second Congo War, which means unfortunately there was no happy end after that. Kabila falls out with his former allies and he drives out all of the foreign forces. Especially Rwanda didn't like that, because with Kabila as their rather weak ally, they hoped to install a proxy regime in Kinshasa to have better control over opposing militias, but of course also over the vast resources of the Eastern Congo. In 1998, only shortly after the First Congo War ended, Rwanda backed a new rebel group, which launched a revolt and started the Second Congo War. Even more armed groups emerged from the chaos. Some were backed by Uganda. So now, southern African countries joined in to fight these rebel groups on the side of Kabila's government, which is why this war became known as the Great War of Africa, because of so many new actors from across Africa. This war officially ended in 2003, and the Third Republic, along with a new constitution, was established. So, in theory, we are in a post-colonial period. But the reality for many Congolese in the East is that the conflict never ended. Which is why we are asking this question today, which is this an endless conflict? By now, you may have seen that there was a variety of actors in the two wars. Militias backed by the Congo itself, the Congo's army and armed groups backed by mostly neighboring African countries. And today in 2024 it looks even more complicated, because now we have over 140 different armed groups. But why are they actually still fighting if the war officially ended and the peace treaty was signed? First of all, we still have these active armed groups in the country. Most famously the M23. This M23 is next to Codeco and ADF the most active armed group in the Congo among the 140. The M23 launched an offensive in late 2012, seizing Goma, the capital of the North Kivu province, which is probably the most significant city in the Congo in this conflict. A special UN force, along with the Congolese FARDC, pushed the rebels back into the eastern hills on the border with Rwanda in 2013. But these days, in 2024, they are again, together with the Rwandan military, just a few kilometers away from Goma. This offensive already caused millions of displaced people in the area. Both sides, the Rwandan and the Congolese forces, are killing and raping the people that are trying to flee the war zone. The M23 and the Rwandan forces are directly targeting densely populated areas, like the cities around Goma and also the camps for the displaced people. But how to stop this? How to help these people? The problem is, there is no clear good and bad side in this conflict. We have the Rwandan forces, the military and the M23 that, even though Rwandan President Paul Kagame is denying it, is heavily backing and arming this violent group. We have other militias backed by Uganda, like the ADF, which is now also linked to ISIS. We have pro-Congolese militias and vigilante groups committing war crimes, and of course the Congolese army itself. The Congolese army is maybe the most important factor here. Some describe the Congolese army as an autoimmune disease, because it is essentially fighting itself. The issue with most of the militaries is the same. They are actually fighting their own raison d'être. If there would be no war, there would be no reason for any army, right? So the Congolese army became invested in the fighting itself. The state never really had a grip over the army either. Even Congolese President Tshisekedi called the Congolese army a mafia operating under the law of Omerta. But it is, as I said, they never really wanted a strong, structured and organized military in the Congo, because Congolese leaders have long seen their own security forces as their greatest threat. And understandably so. Mobutu took power in a military coup d'etat and then spent 3 decades fending off coup plots against him. The man who eventually ousted Mobutu, the rebel leader Laurent Kabila, was assassinated by his own bodyguard. Kabila's successor, his own son Joseph, managed to avoid the same fate, but still faced multiple coup attempts. So Tshisekedi is actually happy that this rampaging and disorganized army is not bothering him in Kinshasa, but the area of Goma, which is thousands of kilometers away from him. And as every politician, he tries to turn this conflict in a populist way to his advantage. Tshisekedi is calling out Rwanda as the bad guy in this conflict. He even compared Kagame to Adolf Hitler and threatened to march on Kigali, even though he knows well that his military could never match the Rwandan forces. But what are the motives of Kagame and Rwanda? Without going over the official motives, let's just directly jump to the real ones. It's about the Congo's resources, of course. The Congo is literally a gold mine for Rwanda. Since 2016, Rwanda's largest export has been gold, much of which is smuggled in from the Congo. This is made possible by the M23, which keeps the borderlands area weak, so smuggling is easy. But of course, it's not only Rwanda that is profiting from the Congo's resources. There are also Uganda and Burundi, and international players who are profiting from the vulnerable state of the Congo. There is, for example, China, which controls the majority of the mining assets in the DRC, and there is Glencore, the Swiss mining giant, who has some of the largest copper mines in the world in Congo. And by the way, this company has a bigger budget than the entire state of the Congo. Imagine that. How is this even possible? I'll tell you. It's on purpose. The Democratic Republic of the Congo is weak by design, like the military. The function of the Congolese state is to be weak, because many different parties benefit from this weakness. The weak state allows parasitic, opportunistic, international and local actors to join in the exploitation of this country. Even looking back at everything that has happened since the official peace deal, there was never a real peace process. Land was not given back. There was no reconciliation, nor a demobilization of the armed forces. So what we see today is no surprise to anyone. Every killed civilian or raped child is a calculated casualty. Collateral damage for the greater good, which is money. What could we do? Because there would be options actually. Let's focus on 3 potential solutions. So first thing would be to pull the lever over Rwanda. The Western donors need to suspend their aid to Rwanda's government. It can't be that as the M23 is seizing more land, the EU commits millions of euros to support the Rwandan military. Rwanda has received around $1 billion in investments from European donors, but it is still Washington who is the state's largest donor. Rwanda receives so much support by the West because it invested heavily in polishing up its reputation over the years. Kigali spends millions on advertising, with even European soccer teams wearing Visit Rwanda on their jerseys. Tony Blair, Howard Buffett, Bill Gates, they all have close ties to Kagame. Celebrities like Idris Elba, Kevin Hart or Kendrick Lamar are promoting the country. Besides that, the development of the Rwandan military is helping the West by giving the Central African Republic a counterweight to Russian security contractors. They are also at work in Mozambique, where they help protect a $20 billion gas investment by the French company Total Energies. Rwanda has now also a lever on the West, as you can see. Yet Kigali benefits more from this relationship. So now the US and the European diplomats need to apply pressure, suspend investments or put them under harsher conditions. Then Rwanda can't afford the arming of the M23 anymore. The second thing to do would be then the building up of a strong state by stopping the fragmentation inside the institutions, by strengthening and publicizing democracy. Because so far, democracy in the Congo has been largely ceremonial, and parties are heavily people-driven, not idea-driven. This task of state building will take time, but the Congo deserves a strong state, so that it can sit down with the big players and have a real weight in the negotiations over its resources. This would bring us to the third step, which could only come after the 2 steps already happened, taking control over the resources. Considering the abundance of rare earths and metals, estimations go as high as $24 trillion. That drives so many countries to pillage the Congo. The DRC itself should be the main profiteer of that. That does not necessarily mean nationalization, but a control over the mining companies. Some degree of industrialization would also be necessary, so that the metals can be refined in the Congo. As Rodney wrote in his book How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, when the citizens of Europe own the land and mines of Africa, this is the most direct way of sucking the African continent. So long as foreigners own land, mines, factories, banks, then for so long would the wealth of Africa flow outwards into the hands of those elements. So with these steps, the Congo could come back to Lumumba's wishes for his country to rise up again and regain its dignity in the pure light of day. Thank you for watching. I would love to hear what you think of this conflict. What would be options to bring peace to the Congo? And let me know what other topics you'd like to see covered next.